The next morning dawned gray and heavy with mist. Evelyn barely slept a wink. Every sound outside had set her heart racing. Every gust of wind had felt like the whisper of a threat. She sat by the dying fire, hands clasped tightly, waiting for Caleb to return from the barn. When he finally entered, the look in his eyes made her stomach twist. It wasn't anger, exactly, but a guarded distance she hadn't seen in months. He stood by the door, removing his hat slowly. "Evelyn," he began, voice low, "you need to tell me the truth. Who is that man really, and what does he have over you?" She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Charles DuPont was my employer's son in New Orleans. He pursued me relentlessly when I worked as a seamstress in his mother's shop. When I refused him, he made it impossible for me to stay. He ruined my name, told everyone I had seduced him for money. I lost everything because of his lies. I ran to save what was left of my dignity." Caleb studied her in silence, his jaw tight. "And this engagement contract he talked about?" "A fabrication," she said quickly. "He forged my signature. He thinks his wealth can make anything true." Caleb's eyes softened, but the pain there didn't fade completely. "You should have told me. I wanted to," she whispered, tears threatening. "But every time I tried, I remembered how people looked at me when they believed him. I thought if you knew, you'd look at me that way too." He turned away, staring into the fire. "You should know better than that by now." Before she could respond, the sound of hoofs thundered outside. They exchanged a glance, both recognizing the rhythm fast, purposeful. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Evelyn followed, heart pounding. Charles DuPont rode up with 2 hired men at his side, smug and composed as ever. "I told you I'd be back," he said, dismounting. "I've come to collect what's mine." Caleb leveled the rifle at him, his voice calm but dangerous. "You best get back on that horse before I decide I don't like the sight of you." DuPont laughed coldly. "You think this little farmhand romance changes anything?" "The law is on my side. I've got papers, witnesses. She belongs to me." "She belongs to no one," Caleb said, stepping forward. "And I don't give a damn about your papers." The 2 men behind DuPont shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. Evelyn could feel it too, the kind of stillness before lightning strikes. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "Charles, stop this. You don't want me. You just want to control what you couldn't have. You ruined me once, but you won't do it again." His eyes darkened. "You think this cowboy can protect you forever? He doesn't know the world like I do. I could destroy both of you before nightfall." Caleb's jaw flexed, his finger twitching near the trigger. "Try it?" For a moment, time froze. The only sounds were the horses snorting and the wind in the trees. DuPont's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected defiance, certainly not from Evelyn. "You'll regret this," he spat, turning to mount his horse. "I'll be back with the law." Caleb lowered his gun, watching as DuPont and his men rode away. Only when they vanished into the distance did he finally exhale. Evelyn stood trembling beside him. "He won't stop," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly, looking at her. "But neither will I." He turned to her then, his voice steady, his gaze holding hers with a fierce promise. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Not while I'm breathing." Tears filled her eyes. For months she'd lived under the shadow of her past, but in that moment, standing beside the man who refused to let her face it alone, Evelyn felt something she hadn't dared to believe in hope. As the mist lifted from the fields and sunlight broke through, the 2 of them stood on the porch, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, the ghosts of her past no longer owned her. She had thought she'd found only shelter in Caleb Turner as home, but she had found her courage, her heart, and a man who would fight for both. The morning after the confrontation dawned quiet and golden, the storm of the previous day replaced by a calm so deep it felt like the earth itself was catching its breath. Evelyn awoke to the scent of coffee and the sound of the wind brushing softly through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel trapped between fear and memory. Instead, there was peace, a fragile peace, yes, but real. When she stepped outside, she found Caleb in the corral, mending the last stretch of broken fencing. He worked with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled up, sunlight glinting off the sweat on his arms. He looked up when he sensed her, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "Fence won't fix itself," he said with a half-smile, nodding toward the tools. Evelyn smiled faintly. "And you'd work yourself to death before breakfast if I let you." He chuckled under his breath, but there was something different in his gaze, softer, more open. As she joined him, he handed her a hammer. They worked side by side, the rhythmic clink of metal against wood filling the quiet. After a while, Caleb spoke, his voice low. "He won't be back for a few days." "If he comes at all?" Evelyn hesitated. "You sound certain. I've seen men like him before," he said. "They're loud when they think they hold power. But when they meet someone who won't bow, they fold or crawl back to where they came from." He paused, looking at her. "Still, I'll ride into town tomorrow. Make sure the sheriff knows what kind of man he is." "You do that? For me?" she asked softly. "I'd do a lot more than that," Caleb said, the words rough but honest. Something inside her trembled. She had spent so much of her life expecting men to take her voice, her safety, her choice, but Caleb gave her space, respect, and the freedom to stand beside him instead of behind him. When they finished, he leaned against the fence post, watching the horizon. "When you first came off that stagecoach," he said slowly, "I thought you were too fine for this place. Thought you'd be gone before the first snow melted." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And now? Now I can't imagine this place without you." The words landed between them, unadorned and raw. Evelyn's breath caught. She wanted to speak, but all she could manage was, "I never meant to stay. But somehow, I can't imagine leaving." He turned toward her then, closing the distance between them. For a long moment, neither moved, just silence and the faint sound of wind through the grass. His eyes searched hers, asking permission without words. She nodded once, just barely. When he kissed her, it wasn't desperate or hurried. It was gentle like a promise. The roughness of his hands cradled her face, the warmth of his mouth melting every shard of fear she'd carried. Time seemed to slow until all that existed was the heartbeat of two people who had weathered loneliness and loss, finding solace in each other's strength. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. "What happens now?" she whispered. He smiled against her hair. "Now we start over. Together." The word together felt like sunlight breaking through the last shadow of her past. For the first time in years, Evelyn wasn't running from pain, from shame, from the ghosts of what had been. She was standing still, facing forward, with a man who had taught her that love wasn't to ownership or rescue, it was choosing to stay again and again. As the sun climbed higher, warming the land, Caleb took her hand. They walked back toward the house, their house now, where the coffee still steamed on the table and the fire still burned softly in the hearth. Outside, spring had begun in earnest, and the ranch hummed with life. The fields would need plowing, the calves branding, and there would always be more work to do. But beneath it all ran something deeper, a quiet rhythm of shared hearts, a promise of home. The cowboy who'd once ordered a simple bride had found far more than he ever asked for. And the dark beauty who stepped off the stagecoach had finally found where she belonged, not in the shadow of fear, but in the light of a love strong enough to last a lifetime. The world after the storm looked new, clean, and still, blanketed in a dazzling white that shimmered under the weak winter sun. The air was crisp, the kind that stung the lungs but smelled of fresh beginnings. Evelyn stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, gazing over the endless field of snow. The land seemed to stretch forever, untouched and pure. For the first time in years, she felt the same, like the past had been buried beneath a fresh layer of quiet. Inside, Caleb chopped wood near the barn, his breath fogging in the cold. He worked hard and steady, as he always did, but something in him had shifted since that night. The memory of her hands on his, the warmth in her voice when she said she was tired of being afraid of kindness, it lingered like an ache in his chest. He had promised himself he wouldn't want again, wouldn't reach for more than companionship. But Evelyn James was testing that resolve with every smile, every glance, every soft word that filled his home with light. The ranch began to return to its rhythm. The ranch hands came and went, the cattle were fed, the fences mended. Yet there was a new ease between the two of them. At supper, she would tease him about how seriously he took his work. He would grumble good-naturedly and hide a smile. Sometimes he caught her humming as she hung laundry, and he'd pause in his work just to listen. But the closeness between them deepened one afternoon when an accident forced their unspoken feelings into the open. Caleb had gone out to check the northern paddock, where the fence had been weakened by snow. When he didn't return by sunset, Evelyn's worry grew unbearable. She wrapped herself in a coat and trudged through the snow until she found him kneeling beside a fallen post, clutching his hand. Blood seeped through his glove. "Caleb," she cried, rushing to him. "I'm fine," he muttered through gritted teeth, though his face was pale. "Just nicked myself on a nail." "Fine?" She scolded, kneeling beside him. "You're bleeding through your glove." She pulled it off before he could protest. The cut was deep, angry red against the cold. "You'll get frostbite if we don't clean this." She helped him to his feet and half-guided, half-dragged him back to the house. He was reluctant, embarrassed by his own carelessness, but she ignored his grumbling. Once inside, she sat him by the fire and brought a basin of warm water. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound, dabbing gently despite his winces. "You're too stubborn for your own good," she murmured. "And you're too bossy for a guest," he shot back softly, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. She looked up, their eyes locking. The teasing faded into something else, something fragile, electric. Her fingers stilled on his hand, but neither moved away. His rough skin was warm beneath her touch, his pulse strong under her fingertips. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For caring," her breath caught. Someone should. Silence stretched between them, thick with all the words they hadn't said. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as though afraid she might vanish if he held too tight. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest. For a long moment, they sat that way, hands joined, firelight flickering over their faces, the rest of the world falling away. When he finally released her, his voice was rough. "I don't know what you've been through, Evelyn, but I want you to know you're safe here, with me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him how long she had waited for words like that, but emotion stole her voice. All she could do was nod. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Caleb lingered by the fire long after she went to bed, staring at his bandaged hand. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers entwined with his, the gentlest touch he'd known since before grief had turned him to stone. He had asked for a simple bride, nothing more. But what he found was a woman who stirred life back into his soul, and he feared that if he reached for her heart, he might never let go. By early spring, the snow began to melt, uncovering patches of brown grass and the promise of green beneath. The Turner Ranch came alive again, streams gurgled with thawing ice, calves were born, and the air filled with the scent of earth. Inside the house, laughter had returned, too. Caleb and Evelyn worked side by side, their once formal exchanges replaced by quiet ease. Sometimes he'd find her standing by the window in the mornings, sunlight spilling across her face, and he'd think, without meaning to, that she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She brought life to his home, warmth to his days, and a calm joy that frightened him with its depth. But peace rarely lasts long on the frontier. One afternoon, while Caleb was repairing the stable roof, a rider appeared on the horizon. The man was well-dressed, his horse gleaming, his coat tailored to city perfection, a sight so out of place that even the ranch hands stopped to stare. He dismounted with practiced ease and approached the porch where Evelyn was sweeping. When she looked up, the broom fell from her hands. Her heart froze. "Evelyn," he said smoothly, his voice dripping familiarity. "You've been difficult to find, Charles DuPont." The name hit her like a blow. He looked the same handsome, composed, his smile sharp as glass. But his eyes still held that same predatory gleam she had fled from years ago. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the hands couldn't hear. "You ran away from me, Evelyn, from us. You embarrassed me before half the city, and I had to explain why my bride vanished before the wedding. Do you know what that did to my reputation?" "I was never your bride," she said, taking a step back. "And I owe you nothing." "Oh, but you do," he hissed. "You signed a contract of engagement witnessed and legal. You're still bound to me, and I've come to take you home." Before she could answer, Caleb appeared from around the barn, hat in hand, face shadowed with suspicion. "Is there a problem here, Miss James?" DuPont turned, smiling thinly. "Mr. Turner, I presume. I'm Charles DuPont, Miss James's fiancé. She left New Orleans in a rather unfortunate misunderstanding. I've come to collect her." Caleb's expression darkened. "That true?" he asked Evelyn quietly. She shook her head, her eyes pleading. "No, it's a lie." "I was never his," DuPont scoffed. "You believe her? You think a woman like her running from city to city comes without history? She deceived you, Mr. Turner, just as she deceived everyone else." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. But Evelyn could see the flicker of hurt in his eyes, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Her chest tightened painfully. She had known her past would catch her, but she hadn't expected it to steal her peace so quickly. "I think you should leave," Caleb said evenly, though his voice was strained. "Now," DuPont smiled, adjusting his gloves. "I'll give you time to reconsider. You'll all realize soon enough that a man of my standing wasn't to be dismissed so easily." He turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and rode off toward town. When he was gone, Evelyn turned to Caleb, desperate to speak, but he had already walked past her, his face unreadable. "I need time to think," he said quietly. Then he disappeared into the barn. That night, Evelyn sat alone by the fire, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had feared many things in her life, but not this, that the man who had come to mean so much might believe the worst of her. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks of the old house. It carried with it the echo of the past she thought she'd buried, and now it had returned to test everything she and Caleb had begun to build. But deep in her heart, Evelyn vowed this time she wouldn't run. She would face the man who once ruined her and prove to Caleb Turner that love built on truth could weather any storm. Summer had settled over the Montana plains, wrapping the land in a golden hush. Days on the Turner ranch were long but steady. Evelyn rose with the dawn, baked bread, churned butter, and tended the chickens. Caleb worked the fields and cattle, often stealing glances toward the house where her laughter sometimes drifted through the open window. The awkward silence that had once filled their days began to fade, replaced by quiet companionship. Evelyn no longer flinched when he entered a room, and Caleb found himself looking forward to her small smiles, her soft-spoken observations about the sky, or how the air smelled before rain got still. Something in her remained hidden. He sensed it in the way she sometimes went still staring out toward the horizon, her eyes clouded with thoughts she never spoke. One afternoon, a wagon arrived from town with supplies. Among the visitors was Henry Ward. a traveling trader who had spent time back east. As Caleb bartered for tools, Evelyn carried a tray of lemonade outside, polite and graceful as ever. Henry's eyes widened when he saw her. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Miss Evelyn James, is that truly you?" The tray trembled in her hands, a faint clink of glass betraying her calm. "I beg your pardon? You don't remember me?" he said, smiling in disbelief. "I was at the DuPont wedding in New Orleans before the scandal broke." His tone carried more curiosity than malice, but the damage was instant. Caleb's head snapped toward Evelyn, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Evelyn managed a brittle smile, murmured something about tending the kitchen, and slipped back inside. Caleb excused himself from the trader and followed. She stood by the sink, hands gripping the counter, shoulders tight with shame. "Evelyn," Caleb said quietly. "Who is DuPont?" Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "A man I wish I'd never met." He waited, silent. She drew a long breath, then spoke. "Charles DuPont was a businessman in New Orleans. After my father died, he offered to marry me, said he'd save my family's name. But his kindness was a mask. When I refused him, he made certain I would regret it. He told lies. Sighed I was a temptress, that I toyed with men. The city turned its back on me. I lost everything, my home, my work, my reputation." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And you came here to start over?" "Yes," her voice broke. "I wanted to be judged for what I could do, not for the gossip men spread about me. I used my middle name in the letter E. James because I thought maybe, out here, my past couldn't reach me." He didn't speak. For a long moment, only the ticking clock filled the room. Evelyn turned away, her hands twisting in her apron. "I understand if you wish me gone," she said quietly. "I should have told you sooner. But I feared that I'd think the worst of you." He finished for her. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Caleb took a slow step closer. "I don't care what some rich fool said years ago. I've watched you work here every day. I know who you are." Her breath hitched. "You believe me?" "I do." His voice was steady, rough around the edges. "But I'm angry not at you, Evelyn. At the world that made you afraid to speak the truth." Her tears fell freely then, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar weight of being believed. He reached out, hesitant, and brushed a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The room felt smaller, their nearness charged with something fragile and fierce. Then Caleb stepped back, his voice low. "You don't have to hide anymore. Not here." When he walked out to finish his chores, Evelyn leaned against the counter, trembling. His words lingered like a promise. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a fugitive from her own life, but deep down, both of them knew the past never truly stayed buried. Somewhere far away, the name Charles DuPont still echoed in the world. And trouble had a way of finding what it once lost. The first snow of winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains like a ghost. The wind howled across the plains, turning the Turner Ranch into a white frozen sea. Caleb had been out since dawn, securing the fences and rounding up strays before the storm worsened. Evelyn had begged him not to go so far, but he'd only tipped his hat and said, "Can't leave the herd to freeze, ma'am." By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of steel. The wind tore through the land, fierce and unrelenting. Evelyn paced the cabin, feeding the fire and glancing at the window every few minutes. Snow piled high against the panes, blurring the world into silence. When she finally saw Caleb's figure stumble through the storm, leading a calf wrapped in burlap, her breath caught in relief. She threw open the door as he staggered inside, snow dusting his coat and beard. His hands were numb, his face raw with cold. Without a word, Evelyn hurried to him, pulling off his gloves, guiding him toward the fire. "Sit," she ordered, her voice firmer than usual. "You'll freeze if you don't." He tried to protest, but his words came out slurred. She knelt in front of him, taking his hands between hers, rubbing warmth back into them. Her touch was gentle but steady. The feel of her skin against his soft, alive, real sent a tremor through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're shaking," she murmured. Her brow furrowed. "So are you," he replied, his voice rough. They both laughed then, quietly, almost shyly, as if laughter itself might break the fragile stillness around them. The fire crackled, throwing soft light across the room, and the blizzard outside became a distant hum. Hours passed. They tended the calf together, feeding it milk and wrapping it near the hearth. The storm grew fierce, pounding against the walls. But inside there was warmth of fire, of comfort, of something deeper neither dared name. When the wind howled loud enough to shake the shutters, Evelyn flinched. Caleb noticed. "You're safe here," he said gently. "The storm can't touch you." She smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "It's not the storm that frightens me, Mr. Turner. It's the quiet that comes after." He looked at her, puzzled. "When things are still," she explained softly, "I remember the places I left behind, the people who hurt me. The silence reminds me of how alone I was." Caleb's heart clenched. He sat forward, his voice low. "You're not alone anymore, Evelyn." The way he said her name, slow, steady, full of meaning, made her chest tighten. Their eyes met, the firelight flickering between them. For the first time, neither looked away. He reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed a loose curl from her cheek. His fingers lingered, tracing the line of her jaw. Evelyn's breath caught, but she didn't pull back. In that single touch, all their restraint, all their careful distance, began to crumble. "I'm sorry," Caleb murmured, lowering his hand. "I shouldn't. Don't be," she whispered. "I'm tired of being afraid of kindness." The storm raged harder outside, wind wailing like a wild thing, but in that small cabin, something changed. The walls that had held grief and loneliness for years now held the fragile beginning of trust. As night fell, Evelyn dozed in a chair near the hearth, wrapped in a quilt. Caleb watched her quietly from across the room, her face soft in the firelight, her breathing even. For the first time in 5 years, he felt peace, real, gentle peace. Outside, the storm began to ease, leaving a world buried in snow. Inside, two souls who had spent years surviving began, without realizing it, to heal. Neither of them spoke of what had passed between them that night, but both felt it. Something had shifted, subtle, deep, and impossible to ignore. And though the storm had finally ended, Caleb knew in his heart that something far stronger was just beginning. The stagecoach from Helena rumbled through the dusty trail, its wheels creaking as it descended into the small Montana town of Willow Creek. A veil of late spring dust hung in the air, stirred by the hooves of the horses. The passengers inside swayed with every jolt, each lost in their own thoughts. But none were as silent or as tense as Evelyn James. After weeks of travel through endless plains and rugged mountains, she sat stiffly in her seat, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her bonnet shadowed her face, but the driver had noticed how the sun seemed to find her anyway, glinting off her smooth, dark skin. She was a vision, though her clothes were simple and travel-worn. The few men in the coach had stolen glances, unsure whether her quiet dignity invited conversation or forbade it. Evelyn's heart pounded as the town came into view, a scattering of wooden buildings, a church spire, and the faint curl of smoke rising from chimneys. Somewhere out there was Caleb Turner, the man who had written her those steady, careful words that had changed the course of her life. She had reread his letter so many times she knew every word by heart. He wanted a simple woman, plain and honest. And though she had tried to dress plainly, she feared her presence would betray her because there was nothing plain about the life she had lived or the secrets she carried. As the stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the post office, the driver called out, "Willow Creek. Last stop." Evelyn's heart leapt. She gathered her small trunk and carpet bag, stepping carefully down the wooden step. The dry wind rushed around her, tugging at her skirt and lifting a few curls from beneath her bonnet, and then she saw him. Caleb Turner stood near the hitching post. Tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the sun. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, tanned forearms. He looked exactly as she had imagined, steady, solid, with a quiet strength that drew the eye without demanding it. But when he turned to look at her, his expression changed, just slightly, but enough that she noticed. He had expected someone else. For a moment, the world seemed to still. His blue-gray eyes swept over her, hesitant, startled, almost disbelieving. He had been expecting a modest, unremarkable woman, someone who would blend easily into the rhythms of ranch life. But the woman before him was striking poised, graceful, her dark skin luminous in the afternoon sun. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced hardship and refused to be broken. "Mr. Turner?" she asked softly, her voice low and musical. He blinked, his hat twisting in his hand. "Ma'am, you must be Miss James." "Yes," she said, managing a small smile. "I hope the journey hasn't kept you waiting too long." He cleared his throat, nodding quickly, as though trying to recover his composure. "No, ma'am, not at all. I didn't expect." He stopped himself, flushing slightly. "Welcome to Willow Creek." Around them, curious eyes watched from the saloon porch and general store windows. A few ranch hands exchanged murmurs, some amused, others impressed. A dark-skinned woman from New Orleans was not a common sight in this dusty corner of the Montana frontier. Evelyn felt their stares prick at her skin but held her head high, meeting Caleb's gaze with quiet steadiness. He took her bag, and for a brief second, their fingers brushed. His hand was rough, hers soft but strong. Something unspoken passed between them, something both unexpected and undeniable. As he helped her onto the wagon that would take them to his ranch, Caleb couldn't help glancing at her again. The wind tugged at the ribbon of her bonnet, and for an instant her eyes met his deep, dark, and full of something that made his chest tighten. He had written for a simple bride, a woman of plain character and modest appearance. But the woman who stepped off that stagecoach had taken his breath away before she even spoke her name, and deep down, Caleb Turner knew his life was about to change forever. The wagon wheels turned slowly across the open prairie, the sky stretching wide and endless above. Caleb sat on the driver's bench beside Evelyn, the reins loose in his calloused hands. The horse's steady rhythm was the only sound between them for miles. He wasn't sure what to say. Every time he glanced at her, words caught in his throat. Evelyn sat straight, hands folded in her lap, her bonnet shielding her face from the sun. She could feel his eyes on her now and then, curious, cautious, uncertain. She couldn't blame him. He had written for a woman who was plain and quiet, a companion without airs. Instead, he had received a stranger whose very presence seemed to disturb the stillness of his life. When they reached the Turner Ranch, the land unfolded before them in a breathtaking expanse, rolling grasslands, a line of cottonwoods by the creek, and a sturdy ranch house of timber and stone. The late afternoon light cast everything in gold, and Evelyn drew a quiet breath. It was beautiful, but also lonely. There was not another home in sight. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand brushing hers. "It ain't much," he said, looking at the house, "but it's solid. Built it myself." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's lovely," she said honestly. "Peaceful." He led her inside. The house smelled of pine wood and coffee, with a fire burning low in the hearth. The furniture was simple but clean, and though the space felt sparse, there was a quiet pride in every corner. He showed her the kitchen, the small parlor, and finally, the room that would be hers for now. "You'll have this room to yourself," he said, clearing his throat. Until we get things settled proper." She nodded, understanding his discomfort. They were, after all, strangers bound by a letter and an agreement neither of them fully understood yet. Over the next days, Evelyn threw herself into work. She rose before dawn to make breakfast, swept the floors, laundered clothes, and tended the small garden out back. The ranch hands, 5 men roughened by the frontier, watched her with wary fascination. She was polite but distant, refusing to be intimidated by their smirks or whispers. Caleb noticed, though he said nothing, that the men began to treat her with unexpected respect after she mended a torn shirt for one and baked warm bread for the crew. Still, awkwardness hung between her and Caleb like a ghost. At supper, they spoke little beyond necessity. He would ask if she needed supplies or if she was settling in, and she would answer with quiet formality. He admired her diligence but was unsettled by how she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. When she bent by the firelight, her face soft and thoughtful, he found himself staring too long one evening. He returned late from the fields to find her standing by the window, humming a tune so gentle it barely rose above the wind. The melody was unfamiliar, something southern, lilting, and sad. Her voice filled the small room with warmth that made his chest ache. "You sing real pretty," he said softly. Startled, she turned. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand. "Don't apologize. It's been a long time since this house had music." Their eyes met for a moment that lingered too long. Something unspoken flickered there, a longing neither dared to name, but as quickly as it came, it vanished. Evelyn looked away, and Caleb stepped back, his heart pounding. He reminded himself that this was a business arrangement. She was here to help, not to stir up the ghosts of love he had buried. And yet, as he lay awake that night, listening to the faint sound of her footsteps in the next room, Caleb Turner realized the house didn't feel empty anymore. He had wanted only companionship and peace. But the woman who had come to his ranch carried both silence and storm within her, and he was beginning to feel the pull of both. The wind rolled across the wide Montana plains, carrying with it the smell of sage and snow. Caleb Turner stood on the porch of his ranch house, gazing at the fading horizon where the sky met the land in a wash of amber and gray. The world out here was vast, silent, and often lonely, just like him at 35. Caleb had built one of the most respected cattle operations in the territory. His hands were calloused from years of work, his shoulders broad from the weight of labor and solitude alike. Yet, despite the success that surrounded him, the sturdy barns, the fine herd, the loyal ranch hands, he felt the emptiness that lingered in every room of his home. It had been 5 years since he'd buried his wife, Margaret. She had been gentle, quiet, and good-hearted, but her death during childbirth had hollowed out something in him that never quite healed. Afterward, Caleb poured himself into work, convincing himself that he needed nothing more than the land beneath his boots and the herd in his care. But as winters passed and evenings grew longer, the silence became harder to bear. He needed someone to help keep the ranch running, someone who could cook, tend the house, and bring a bit of warmth back into his days. He didn't want love not again. Love was dangerous. It could be ripped away without warning. What he needed was a companion, someone reliable, steady, and untroubled by dreams. And so, one cold morning, Caleb sat at his writing desk by the window and penned a letter to a mail order bride agency based in St. Louis. His handwriting was strong but simple, each word deliberate, like a man measuring his emotions before laying them bare. I am a rancher of 35 years living in the Montana Territory. I seek a woman of quiet character, plain in manner and honest in spirit. I ask for no beauty nor fancy ways, only a heart willing to work beside mine. I can offer food, shelter, and respect. In return, I ask for loyalty and peace. If such a woman exists, I would be grateful for her company. When he finished, he read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and sealed it with wax. The moment the letter left his hands, carried by the postwriter to town, a strange feeling stirred in his chest, half relief, half regret. He wondered what sort of woman might answer. Would she be shy? Homely? Would she smile easily, or keep to herself? He told himself none of it mattered. He wasn't searching for love or passion, only partnership. Still, late that night, as he sat by the fire, the glow flickering across his weathered face, his thoughts drifted. He imagined the sound of another's footsteps in the house again, the quiet clatter of dishes, the hum of a soft voice reading by lamplight. The image both soothed and unsettled him. Caleb didn't realize that the letter he sent would bring more than he bargained for. The agency clerk, moved by the simplicity and sincerity of his request, placed his ad in the next issue of the matrimonial paper. Across the country, women read his words, some laughed, some sighed, but one woman paused. Her name was Evelyn James, and though her life was far from simple, something about his plain, earnest tone spoke to her soul. While Caleb returned to his long days and cold nights, somewhere far to the east, Evelyn folded his letter between her fingers, reading it again and again as though she could feel the man behind the ink. Neither knew it yet, but that single letter so simple, so restrained, would set in motion a story neither of them could have foreseen. Out on the Montana plains, the winter wind howled through the cottonwoods, and the man who only wanted a simple bride had already begun to write the first page of his unexpected destiny. In the heart of New Orleans, where the Mississippi shimmered with secrets and the streets thrummed with life, Evelyn James sat by a dim window, the last rays of sunlight painting her skin with a burnished glow. Outside, the carriages rattled and laughter echoed from the French Quarter, but Evelyn heard none of it. Her thoughts were far away, tangled between fear and longing. She had just finished reading the letter again, the one from the rancher in the Montana Territory. The words were simple, unembellished, but they struck her with quiet power. I seek a woman of quiet character, plain in manner and honest in spirit. There was no flattery, no promises of wealth or grandeur, just honesty. That, above all, drew her in. Evelyn had not known honesty in a long time. She came from a family that had once been prosperous. Her father, a respected lawyer, had raised her with refinement and education, teaching her music, reading, and the grace expected of a lady. But when he died suddenly, debts poured in like a tide. Their home was sold, servants dismissed, and the friends who had once admired her mother's dinners now crossed the street to avoid them. Evelyn, at 26, found herself the sole caretaker of a fading name and an ailing mother. It was during that desperate time she caught the attention of Charles DuPont, a wealthy businessman known for his charm and his cruelty. He offered her a future, but his admiration soon turned to possession. When she refused his advances, he sought revenge, spreading vile rumors until no respectable family would hire or receive her. After her mother's death, Evelyn was left alone, her reputation in ruins, her beauty turned into a mark of scandal. For months she lived quietly, taking sewing work and teaching piano to children. But every time she walked through the marketplace, she could feel eyes following her, some with pity, others with hunger. The city that once promised her life now choked her with memories. She knew she had to leave, but she had nowhere to go. Then she saw it. a small advertisement in the back of a matrimonial newspaper. Montana rancher seeks companion of quiet character. Food, shelter, and respect offered. The words seemed to reach out of the page. Food, shelter, respect. Simple promises, yet more than she had been offered in years. She wrote her reply that night by candlelight, the flame trembling like her hand. She didn't use her full name, just E. James. She told the truth about her skills and her hard-working nature, but not about her past or the man who had destroyed it. She only said she wanted a chance to start anew, to be useful, to live quietly. When she sealed the letter, she sat for a long time, staring at the wax, her heart hammering. It felt like sealing a chapter of her life closed forever. Weeks passed before a letter arrived in return. The rancher had accepted. A ticket was enclosed. She could hardly breathe as she held it, a ticket to a place she couldn't even imagine. Montana Territory. She'd only seen pictures in books, endless sky, wild land, untamed beauty. It frightened her, but it also called to something deep inside her soul, a hunger for freedom, for clean air untainted by gossip or fear. On the morning of her departure, Evelyn stood before the cracked mirror in her rented room. She wore a modest traveling dress of gray wool and tied her hair in a simple knot. There was no jewelry, no perfume, nothing of the life she was leaving behind. She looked at her reflection one last time, then whispered, "This time I belong to no one." As the stagecoach rumbled away from New Orleans, Evelyn didn't look back. She clutched Caleb Turner's letter to her chest, her only compass to a new beginning. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, her heart dared to hope. Somewhere far across the plains, a man waited for her expecting a simple bride. But Evelyn was no simple woman, and fate was already smiling at the irony.